The United Federation of Planets does not conscript children. It does not mandate attendance at Federation-run schools. It does not enforce ideology through force or law. Yet across hundreds of member worlds, Federation children grow up speaking the same philosophical language, responding to crisis with the same moral framework, and arriving at adulthood with values so aligned they can serve together on starships without fundamental conflict. This is not coincidence. This is not the natural outcome of peace and plenty. This is the result of the most successful social engineering program in known space, one that operates so seamlessly that most citizens never recognize it as engineering at all. The mechanism is not propaganda, it is infrastructure. The Federation raises your children by controlling the environments where values are formed. It does so through schools that teach a specific curriculum, replicators that normalize shared consumption, social programs that reward conformity to Federation norms, and cultural expectations so pervasive they feel like common sense. By the time a child reaches the age of consent, they have spent 15 years inside systems designed to produce a specific kind of adult. The official story calls this education. The hidden truth is that it is ideological homogenization dressed as enlightenment, and it works because it begins before memory and ends after identity is set. Canon shows us the result everywhere. Federation officers from Earth, Vulcan, Betazoid, and Trill worlds serve together with almost no cultural friction. They share assumptions about individualism, about the value of exploration, about the moral weight of the Prime Directive. They argue over tactics, but rarely over core values. This uniformity is not natural, it is manufactured, and it starts at the table. The Federation replicator is not just a device that produces food. It is a delivery system for cultural norms. On every Federation world, in every home with access to the network, children grow up eating meals that taste identical to meals eaten on distant planets. The replicator does not adapt to local tradition unless specifically programmed to do so. It defaults to a standardized menu, one that reflects Federation ideals of health, efficiency, and shared experience. A child on Andoria eats the same breakfast as a child on Earth, not because their parents chose that meal independently, but because the replicator suggests it. The interface is designed to make the default option the easiest option. This is not accident. It is policy. In the Next Generation episode, Lower Decks, we see junior officers eating together in 10 Forward, sharing meals that are visually indistinguishable despite their different species origins. No one comments on this. No one finds it strange. The homogenization is so complete that it no longer registers as homogenization. It is simply how things are. But behind that seamless experience is a network of decisions made by Federation food scientists, cultural liaisons, and policy architects who determined what constitutes an acceptable meal and then embedded those decisions into every replicator interface in the fleet. The cost is invisible until you ask what is missing. Where are the meals that take 3 hours to prepare? Where are the foods that require ritual, that carry meaning beyond nutrition, that connect a family to ancestors who did not have replicators? They exist, but only as specialty programs, archived under cultural preservation protocols. The child who wants them must know to ask. The child who does not ask eats the default. And the default is Federation standard. And once you accept the meal, you accept the framework that produced it. The Federation school system operates on the same principle. It does not force attendance, but it makes non-attendance nearly impossible. On Earth, and on most core Federation worlds, there are no alternatives that carry the same social weight. Private schools exist, but they are rare, expensive, and often viewed with suspicion. Homeschooling is legal, but parents who choose it must justify that choice to their community, and their children face informal penalties when applying to Starfleet Academy or civilian institutions that prefer graduates of Federation-accredited programs. The curriculum is not overtly political, but it is comprehensively ideological. Children learn mathematics, history, linguistics, and exobiology. They also learn that the Federation represents progress, that pre-warp civilizations require protection from themselves, that individual rights must be balanced against collective stability, and that the pursuit of knowledge justifies almost any risk. These lessons are not presented as opinion, they are presented as fact, embedded in the structure of every subject. In the Deep Space Nine episode In the Hands of the Prophets, we see this system challenged when Vedic Wynn objects to Keiko O'Brien teaching Bajoran children that the wormhole is a natural phenomenon rather than the celestial temple. Keiko does not argue that her lesson is one perspective among many. She argues that her lesson is correct, and that teaching otherwise would be a betrayal of scientific truth. She is right, by Federation standards. But those standards are not neutral. They privilege empirical observation over spiritual belief, and they do so from the first day a child enters a Federation classroom. The consequence is that children raised in Federation schools learn to distrust frameworks that cannot be measured. They grow up believing that faith is a personal choice, but that facts are universal. This is a specific worldview, one that serves Federation interests by producing adults who value evidence-based policy, who defer to experts, and who view tradition as something to be studied rather than obeyed. It is also a worldview that makes it difficult to govern non-Federation populations, because it assumes that reasonable people, given the same facts, will reach the same conclusions. When they do not, the Federation does not know what to do. The emotional standardization is subtler but more invasive. Federation children are taught to value self-expression, but only within boundaries defined by the collective good. They are encouraged to explore their individuality, but discouraged from forming identities that conflict with Federation norms. This is accomplished through counseling, through peer pressure, and through the constant reinforcement of shared narratives. On the Enterprise D, children attend classes led by teachers who report to the ship's command structure. They eat meals in common areas. They participate in group activities designed to build camaraderie. They are surrounded, at all times, by adults who model Federation values, and by peers who have internalized those same values. There is no space outside the system. There is no alternative community where a child might learn that individual loyalty matters more than institutional loyalty, or that some truths cannot be tested in a lab. When Wesley Crusher struggles with the decision to report his fellow cadets in the Next Generation episode, The First Duty, he is not struggling with a moral dilemma. He is struggling with the fact that his instinct to protect his friends conflicts with the values he has been taught since childhood. He chooses the Federation standard because that is the choice he has been trained to make. The episode presents this as growth. It does not acknowledge that this growth required the suppression of an equally valid impulse, and that suppression is the goal. The Federation does not need to conscript soldiers if it can produce adults who volunteer. It does not need to enforce ideology if it can create citizens who believe that ideology is simply reason. The genius of the system is that it operates at the level of identity formation long before a person is capable of questioning it. By the time a Federation child is old enough to ask whether their values were chosen or implanted, those values are so deeply rooted that the question feels like rebellion against the self. The Treaty of Algeron, signed in 2311, banned the Federation from developing cloaking technology. This is presented as a concession to the Romulans, a compromise that kept the peace. But the Federation did not need cloaking technology because it had already won the deeper conflict. It had built a society where citizens believed so completely in the moral superiority of transparency that cloaking felt like cheating. The treaty formalized what was already true. The Federation would not use certain technologies because its people had been raised to view those technologies as wrong. This is the hidden function of Federation education. It does not just teach children what to think, It teaches them how to think in ways that make certain conclusions feel inevitable. A child who grows up in a Federation school learns that cloaking devices are dishonorable, not because they are told this directly, but because every story, every lesson, every model of heroism reinforces the value of openness over deception. By the time they are adults, the Treaty of Algeron is not a restriction, it is common sense. The Dominion War tested this system in ways the Federation had not anticipated. For the first time in a generation, Federation citizens faced an enemy that could not be reasoned with, that did not share their values, and that could not be defeated through exploration and diplomacy. Starfleet needed soldiers, not explorers. It needed people willing to make hard choices, to sacrifice individuals for strategic gain, to operate in moral gray zones that Federation training had taught them to avoid. Some adapted. Many did not. In the Deep Space Nine episode, Statistical Probabilities, a group of genetically enhanced savants calculate that the Federation cannot win the war without unacceptable losses. Their solution is to surrender, to accept Dominion rule, and to preserve Federation lives. They are wrong about the math, but they are right about the deeper problem. The Federation had raised several generations of citizens who believed that peace was always preferable to war, that life was always more valuable than victory, and that compromise was always possible. When confronted with an enemy that rejected all three premises, the system produced paralysis. Starfleet officers who had grown up in the same schools, eaten the same meals, and learned the same lessons found themselves unable to execute the strategies the war required. They hesitated. They second-guessed. They looked for alternatives even when no alternatives existed. This was not cowardice. It was the inevitable result of training that had optimized for exploration, not conquest. The Federation had built a society that could not fight effectively because fighting required instincts the education system had systematically suppressed. The officers who succeeded during the war were outliers. Sisko, who had spent years outside the core Federation worlds. O'Brien, who had learned brutality through experience, not education. Odo, who had never attended a Federation school. Kira, who had been raised by the Resistance. They could make the choices the war demanded because they had not been fully assimilated into the Federation mindset. They still carried frameworks the Federation had not overwritten. And after the war, the Federation did not change its education system. It doubled down. The long-term cost of this approach is visible in how the Federation handles internal dissent. There is no formal mechanism for ideological diversity within Federation culture. There are no schools that teach alternative political theories, no media that seriously questions the foundational premises of the state, no communities that are allowed to raise children according to radically different values. The Maquis were not just a strategic problem. They were a cultural failure, proof that the homogenization was incomplete. The Federation could not tolerate them, not because they were violent, but because they represented a value system that rejected the core Federation premise, that individual suffering is acceptable if it serves the greater peace. The Maquis believed their homes mattered more than treaties. They believed loyalty to place outweighed loyalty to institutions. They believed the Federation had betrayed them, and they were willing to fight rather than accept that betrayal. The Federation's response was not to negotiate, it was to suppress. Starfleet hunted the Maquis with the same resources it used to defend borders, because the Maquis were not just a military threat. They were an ideological contamination, a demonstration that Federation education could fail, that citizens could reject the values they had been taught, and that the system was not as universal as it claimed. When the Dominion wiped out the Maquis, the Federation mourned in public and felt relief in private. The problem was solved, the contamination was eliminated, and the lesson was clear. Leave the Federation framework, and the Federation will not protect you. The replicator network is monitored. This is canon. In the Deep Space Nine episode, Our Man Bashir, we learn that the station's holosuites track user activity. The same infrastructure that delivers meals, that powers entertainment, that makes post-scarcity life possible, also generates data. The Federation knows what you eat, what you read, what you simulate in private. It does not use this data to punish, but it uses it to optimize. The replicator learns your preferences and suggests meals that align with Federation nutritional standards. The library computer recommends texts that reinforce Federation values. The holodeck offers programs that model approved behaviors. This is framed as convenience. It is actually conditioning. Children who grow up inside this system do not learn to question it, because questioning requires a framework outside the system, and no such framework is provided. The schools teach critical thinking, but only within boundaries that assume Federation premises are correct. The holodecks offer historical simulations, but those simulations are written by Federation historians who interpret the past through a Federation lens. The replicators offer variety, but that variety is curated by Federation nutritionists who have already decided what constitutes a healthy choice. By the time a child is 15, they have been shaped by 10,000 small nudges, each one invisible, each one reinforcing the same message. The Federation way is the right way, and alternatives are either primitive, dangerous, or sad. The most insidious aspect of this system is that it produces adults who believe they chose their values freely. They were not coerced. They were not indoctrinated. They simply learned, and they learned well, and the fact that every child in the Federation learned the same things in the same way does not register as a problem because the outcome feels true. A Starfleet officer does not believe in the Prime Directive because they were programmed to believe in it. They believe in it because it makes sense, because it aligns with their instincts, because it feels right. Those instincts were installed. The Prime Directive itself is a case study in how Federation education works. It is not taught as policy, it is taught as ethics, as a principle so fundamental that violating it requires extraordinary justification. Children learn about the directive through stories of first contact gone wrong, of civilizations destroyed by interference, of the moral weight that comes with superior technology. They learn that withholding help is sometimes the kindest choice, that letting people suffer is sometimes necessary, and that the observer must not become the participant. These are not obvious truths. They are specific philosophical positions, and they serve specific Federation interests. The Prime Directive allows the Federation to avoid entanglement in pre-warp conflicts, to conserve resources, to maintain moral high ground, and to justify inaction when intervention would be costly. It is a doctrine of convenience dressed as a doctrine of compassion, and it works because every child in the Federation learns it before they learn to question it. Captain Picard violates the Prime Directive more than once, but always with anguish, always with justification, always with the understanding that he is breaking a sacred rule. He does not ask whether the rule is correct. He assumes it is, because that assumption was installed when he was young, in a classroom on Earth, taught by a teacher who had learned the same lesson in their own childhood. The cycle does not break, because the system does not allow breaks. The Federation's approach to childhood is not unique in history. It mirrors the methods used by every ideology that sought to build a new kind of human. Early education, shared meals, cultural saturation, and the elimination of alternative frameworks. The difference is that the Federation succeeded where others failed, because it had the resources to make compliance feel like freedom, and because it understood that the most effective control is the kind that feels like choice. A child who is told what to believe will rebel. A child who is taught how to think in ways that make certain beliefs inevitable will never recognize the constraint. And that is the genius of the school lunch doctrine. The Federation did not invent this strategy. It refined it. It took the tools of socialization that exist in every culture and weaponized them, turning schools into ideological factories, replicators into normalization engines, and childhood itself into the battleground where the future is won. The reason Federation citizens are so ideologically uniform is not that they lack diversity. It is that their diversity exists only within parameters defined before they could speak. The Vulcans understood this. They rebuilt their entire civilization by controlling how children were taught to process emotion. The Klingons understood it. They built warrior culture by immersing children in stories of honor from birth. The Borg understood it. They assimilated the young first because young minds are easiest to rewrite. The Federation claims to be different, but it uses the same mechanism. It simply disguises it better. At the midpoint of this analysis, the question sharpens. If the Federation produces ideologically uniform citizens by controlling the environments where children grow, can it be called a free society? The answer depends on how you define freedom. The Federation does not restrict speech. It does not punish dissent. It does not criminalize alternative beliefs. But it makes those alternatives nearly impossible to sustain by ensuring that every child grows up inside a framework that defines Federation norms as universal norms. You are free to leave the Federation. You are free to reject its values. But you were not free when those values were installed. You were a child, in a classroom, eating a replicated meal, surrounded by peers who were learning the same lessons. By the time you were old enough to choose, the choice had already been made. The counter-argument is that all societies socialize children. All cultures pass down values. The Federation is no different. But the counter-argument misses the scale. Most societies socialize children into a tradition that is openly acknowledged as tradition. The Federation socializes children into a framework it claims is simply rational, simply humane, simply obvious. It does not say, "This is our way." It says, "This is the way." And because it controls the replicators, the schools, the media, and the social infrastructure across hundreds of worlds, it has the power to make that claim feel true. The Cardassians tried to do the same thing with the Bajorans. They built schools, enforced a curriculum, and tried to raise a generation that would accept occupation as normal. The difference is that Cardassia used force. The Federation uses comfort. The outcome is the same: a population that believes the system is natural, inevitable, and good. The Cardassian attempt failed because it was visible. The Federation attempt succeeds because it is invisible. When Nog joins Starfleet in Deep Space Nine, he is the first Ferengi to do so. This is treated as a triumph, a sign that the Federation is inclusive, that it values diversity. But Nog's story is also a story of assimilation. He does not bring Ferengi values into Starfleet. He abandons Ferengi values to meet Starfleet standards. He learns to suppress profit motive, to value collective good over individual gain, to adopt the emotional framework of his human peers. By the time he graduates, he is Ferengi in appearance only. His mind has been rewritten to align with Federation norms. The Academy did not force this. It simply made clear that success required conformity, and Nog was smart enough to conform. He was rewarded for it. But the cost was the loss of the framework he was raised in, the replacement of one identity with another. The Federation calls this growth. It is more accurately described as erasure. And this is the pattern everywhere. The Federation welcomes diversity as long as that diversity is aesthetic. You can wear your traditional clothes. You can speak your native language. You can celebrate your cultural holidays. But your values must align with Federation values. And if they do not, you will be nudged, counseled, socially pressured, and structurally isolated until you comply or leave. The late-game clincher is this: the Federation cannot stop, even if it wanted to decentralize its education system, to allow true ideological diversity, to permit children to grow up in frameworks that reject Federation premises. It cannot do so without risking the coherence that holds the state together. The Federation is not a nation. It is not an empire. It is a coalition of worlds held together by shared values, and those values exist only because they were installed in childhood. Remove the installation mechanism, and the Federation fractures within a generation. This is why the school lunch doctrine is not a policy choice. It is a survival imperative. The Federation must raise your children for you because the Federation cannot survive adults who do not share its foundational premises. The diversity it celebrates is superficial. The uniformity it requires is existential. The Dominion War proved this. The Maquis proved this. Every time the Federation encounters a group that sincerely rejects its values, the response is the same: contain, suppress, or eliminate. Not because the Federation is cruel, but because it has no mechanism for coexistence with ideologies it cannot assimilate. Its entire structure depends on the assumption that reasonable people, given freedom and resources, will choose Federation values. When they do not, the system breaks. And rather than fix the system, the Federation ensures that fewer people are raised with the capacity to reject it. The child who eats lunch in a Federation school does not know they are part of a program. They do not see the infrastructure around them. They do not recognize the curriculum as ideology, the replicator as a control mechanism, or the shared meal as a tool of normalization. They see friends, teachers, food, and learning. They see a community that cares for them, a society that offers them opportunity, and a future that looks bright. And because they see those things, they grow up believing the Federation is good. They are not wrong. The Federation is good by the standards the Federation taught them. But those standards are not universal. They are not inevitable. They are the product of deliberate choices made by people who understood that the most effective way to build a stable society is to shape the children before they can resist. The Federation presents itself as the culmination of enlightenment, the society that outgrew coercion. The truth is that it perfected coercion by making it invisible. It does not need to force compliance when it can engineer preference. It does not need to suppress dissent when it can prevent dissent from forming. And it does not need to defend its ideology when every citizen was raised to believe that ideology is just common sense. The school lunch doctrine is not a secret. It is not a conspiracy. It is the logical conclusion of a society that values stability over freedom, coherence over diversity, and control over chaos. The Federation raises your children because it cannot afford to let you raise them differently. And it works because by the time you are old enough to object, you no longer want to. The meal was served, the lesson was learned, the values were installed. And the Federation endures because its citizens never think to ask who wrote the menu.